Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome back to Voternomics, where politics and markets collide. This year, voters around the world have the ability to affect markets, countries, and economies like never before. So we've created this series to help you make sense of it all. I'm Allegra Stratton.
And I'm Stephanie Flanders.
So, Steph, we this week are tackling an issue that I think we all think goes to the heart of what Voternomics is all about, which is basically boardrooms colliding with election results. And the reason it's particularly acute this week is probably there's two examples of it. One is what happened at the Washington Post over their decision not to endorse a candidate at all, and whether or not that was complicated by their proprietors' business interests. And then the second is Elon Musk and his appearance, not just once on stage for Trump.
And we had one president who couldn't climb a flight of stairs, and another who was fist pumping after getting shot. Fight!
Many times over the last few months now, his metamorphosis to sort of wannabe politician continues apace.
Your money is being wasted, and the Department of Government Efficiency is going to fix that. Make the margin of victory so big that you know what can happen.
So it's really quite acute this week, isn't it, Steph?
Yeah, I mean, we're used to there being lots of big corporate money involved in US elections, particularly since 2010, where there was a sort of big legal ruling that made it easier for that to happen and for just vast amounts to go into these campaigns over the years. It always makes anyone outside the US, their sort of head spin, the billions involved. But I think what is obviously distinctive about this season is, on the one hand, you have, as you say, the boardroom, the sort of chief executive level, people very nervous of engaging, even to say they support a peaceful transfer of power, which you would have thought would not be controversial. And at the same time, a number of very high-profile billionaires being quite closely associated with the Trump campaign. And we should say there's also been money going on the other side. Our own founder, Michael Bloomberg, and also Bill Gates, it turns out very quietly, have given up to $50 million to Kamala Harris campaign in recent weeks. But, that's been quite low key, even though very large amounts. And then you have, as you say, Elon Musk very publicly not just supporting Donald Trump and amplifying some of the rhetoric and misinformation that is associated with the Trump campaign, but I think also seeming to specifically have corporate interest in Trump winning and potentially a future role in a Trump administration. I think that is a whole new ballgame.
It does feel like something's changed. Warren Buffett backed Obama in 08 and 12, and then Clinton in 16, and this time staying out of the race. There's more examples of that we could cherry pick, but that feels a particularly striking one. I think the question for later in the podcast is, has something changed, or is this a reversion to what should be normal? In a moment, you'll hear our conversation with Charles Elson. He's a leading authority on corporate governance issues and the founding director of the John L. Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance. But before we hear from Charles, we're going to chat about one CEO who has zero qualms about sharing his thoughts and feelings, Elon Musk. Our colleagues at the podcast Elon Inc. have created a special series about Elon Musk's meddling in politics. It is called Citizen Elon, and we are now going to speak with the host, Max Shafkin. Max, did you see this coming? The role that Musk is playing in politics?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I've been paying very close attention to Elon's political evolution over the last couple of years. And with the purchase of Twitter, now X, he has been trending in this direction. I think the surprise, to me anyway, is just the amount of money that he's spending. The latest filings, it's above 130 million. When you sort of look at like what his PAC has spent, the fact that there've been some dark money spending as well, that there's other potential races, and that there's still time between the last filing and election day, we're looking at probably close to $200 million. And that is an enormous amount of money. He's going to be one of the biggest all-time political contributors. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that he spent $44 billion to buy Twitter, now X, and that he has essentially turned that into a right-leaning, a sort of campaign mechanism for former President Trump.
Even with those numbers, when you consider the stakes for Tesla, for SpaceX and so on, people have called this the business opportunity of the century for him, that it's business.
Yes, for sure. And we've seen this with former President Trump, kind of the last go around, like various CEOs attempting to kind of leverage the fact that Trump is sort of ideologically pretty flexible and that he seems to like these sort of CEO types. But you're right. I mean, Elon Musk is kind of unique in his position to sort of benefit from an association with the former president, but also the risks that he faces in terms of regulation, from a potential Harris administration, right? He is a major defense contractor in SpaceX. He would very much like some additional contracts to launch rockets and perhaps develop weapon systems or whatever. You have potential security concerns that have been raised at various times. I'm sure he would very much like those to go away. You also have just like a host of regulatory agencies over the last 5 or so years that have opened investigations or have had investigations or have been looking into various parts of Musk's empire. He would, of course, like to continue to ignore those. And then Tesla, his car company, which is, the biggest source of his wealth, is very much dependent on regulatory structure that, of course, could change and is also vying to launch robotaxis, autonomous vehicles, and is hoping to have friendly regulations there. So there are all sorts of ways that he's already the world's richest person, but that he could become even richer if Donald Trump wins in a week.
Do you think he's expecting a concrete role in the administration? I mean, obviously, the President Trump has talked about him leading a group to find efficiencies in government, and there's potential conflict of interests all over that, given the amount of contracts he has with the government. But do you think he's actually expecting to have a role in the government, or this is more of a defensive position?
It's hard to imagine Elon Musk as like a civil servant, right? Like, I don't know that this is going to be a 5 days a week.
You could say the same about Donald Trump being president.
I don't know that he's going to be, I don't know if he's going to get a badge and show up every day to work. But I do think that this role that he has announced for himself and that Donald Trump has repeatedly on the stump. I was at Madison Square Garden on Sunday in New York, where Trump had this massive rally. Elon played a big role. They were both talking about it. Other people were talking about it. It was getting huge applause lines. The way I interpret this is that Elon Musk will have a big voice in how Donald Trump seeks to reform the executive branch. He's made that a huge part of of his campaign and his kind of political project. So I don't know that we should expect Elon to have a cabinet post or something like that. I think it's much more likely that he will be effectively a senior advisor, maybe the most important senior advisor to the former president.
Unlike many business people, part of his sort of demeanor has often been that you get the sense that these companies are like train sets for him, toys, that he gets to play with. He kind of has that air about him. And I just wondered, does he think the US government is now going to just be another train set for him to play with now that he's bought his way in with this support for Donald Trump and this particular candidate? He might have the scope to do that in a way he wouldn't with another candidate.
It seems like he definitely sees it that way now. Almost 10 years ago or so, SpaceX began selling this flamethrower as a kind of a marketing stunt. And when it became clear that you're not supposed to sell a flamethrower, he changed the name to not a flamethrower. It was a sort of jab at regulators. When people brought up recently that, him being the CEO of Tesla and directing federal policy might be a conflict of interest, he said, oh, don't worry, we'll just change the name of the Department of Government Efficiency to not the Department of Government Efficiency. He clearly thinks that he can essentially approach government the same way that he's approached business, which is by the seat of his pants, ignoring norms and regulations, and like being very productive. And I think that is the optimistic story that you would tell. Like, that is part of why Donald Trump is excited about it, why the voters and why the crowds at Madison Square Garden and other Trump rallies have given him huge rounds of applause. That's what they're excited about. They think he's going to bring that kind of crazy Elon Musk, super productive, super weird, out there business sense to politics.
Going back to sort of boring policy substance for a minute and stripping out some of the more colourful aspects of this, one of the reasons why a few years ago you would have said that this was an unlikely combination was that the one thing that Elon was kind of politically identified with was action to combat climate change, and indeed is put that into action with Tesla, with a huge investment in electric cars. That is one of the things that one would both the support for electric vehicles and the entire stance towards climate change would be one of the big changes under a Trump administration that we'd expect. How does that work? How is he bridging that gulf?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's followed Elon Musk for a long time, and I first met him in 2006, the thing that's weirdest about this is watching Donald Trump get on the stump and essentially deny that climate change is a real problem, and then watching Elon Musk agree with it, because for such a long time, that was impossible to imagine. Elon has been very closely defined with like sort of green capitalism and so on, but he's been pretty ideologically flexible. And that definition of Elon as this green capitalist, it really started during the Obama years, right? He kind of embraced it when it was most politically advantageous and has been walking away from it as it has become sort of maybe less politically advantageous. The other thing is, Elon Musk at this point has a dominant position in electric vehicles. So if Trump were to sort of get rid of all subsidies for EVs, which would be a problem for Tesla, make no mistake, it would arguably hurt Tesla a lot less than a lot of these other automakers who are not selling tons of electric cars right now.
Max, the other thing that you've been following him since 2006, then you will have the Bible on, or certainly the kind of almanac on his flip-flops and his change in positions. For instance, Donald Trump, in the Walter Isaacson biography, it's very clear that when Musk first meets him, he doesn't think much of him. And now we have the possibility of him having a role in a possible Trump second presidency. And there's a host of other issues, aren't there, where he just changes his mind. Either the facts are different or he's sort of evolved. If he were to have a role in government, it might be a bit dismal and constraining, and he might think, actually, I don't want to do this again. But also, he might decide, actually, President Trump isn't doing quite what I want, so I'm going to go.
If Kamala Harris wins next week and becomes a president, there are a host of these investigations, various like issues around his security clearance. Like, I would expect all of those to continue, maybe to even intensify. It would be sort of natural to think that a new administration is going to ask some hard questions about, do we really want one of our largest defense contractors to be in regular touch with Vladimir Putin? Do we really want one of our largest defense contractors smoking pot on the Joe Rogan show, as Elon Musk has done? Now, on the other side, right, there's the upside for Elon Musk with Trump is obvious, right? Trump has said on the stump, we're just going to order up some rockets and take them to Mars, right? He's essentially said we're going to have I'm going to give Elon Musk a multi-billion-dollar contract for a Mars program that doesn't really exist at this point. He's suggested that he's going to let Elon Musk take a red pen to the government, which of course could help him. Now, the thing is, though, Tesla's customer base is largely progressive, is liberal. They are on the left. And I don't think the customer base has fully processed what is happening. And so if Trump is elected, there is going to be a lot of talk politically about the role that Elon Musk played, this historic amount of money and support he played. And that, I think, is going to lead to a backlash that is going to put Tesla under pressure. There are going to be a lot of people who own Teslas who are, I think they're already not feeling awesome about them, but are going to have to think, is this the political statement I want to make? And we've seen this happen with the former president before. He is a cultural force, and it works in both directions. It can really help companies, but it can also create a lot of pressures that could put Elon Musk in an uncomfortable position, could make him want to walk away. Now, if Trump loses, I don't think Elon Musk is going to do a 180. I think he is pretty committed to this kind of right-wing positioning. If Trump were to lose very badly, like a sort of humiliating defeat, which doesn't seem likely based on the polls, then I don't know. Elon is a adaptable guy, and I would not be surprised if he evolved again.
Well, we can certainly expect to see a lot of this played out on X, Twitter.
You're going to be so busy.
Absolutely, yeah.
That was great.
Thank you so much.
Now we welcome Charles Elson. Charles is the founding director of the Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance and a leading authority on corporate governance issues. Charles, this is real issues, right? This is corporate governance issues. This is CEOs trying to navigate what is a very finely balanced US election.
Absolutely. This is sort of governance 101, and it's frankly board oversight of CEOs 101. And it's from a CEO standpoint, it's politics 101. It's a combo of everything, frankly, this year.
So, Charles, tell us, what is different this time round compared to others? Has something changed in this balance?
Well, I think when it happened traditionally, CEOs stayed out of elections. It just wasn't considered a good idea. You alienated too many people by doing it, and the role of the CEO was to run the company, not to be a political figure. That changed a couple of years ago, I think, really basically during the Trump administration, when there was significant opposition to him in parts of the business community. And with the 2000 election, which was considered such a choice, if you will, between two dramatically ways of looking at things, and combined with the summer of George Floyd, companies became much more politically active than they had been. You saw all kinds of statements where companies were opposing changes to the voting rights laws in certain states. You heard all kinds of demands for companies to make statements on political issues. And a lot of CEOs did and felt that it was their role, their obligation to do so. Some did it, I think, based on personal conviction. Others did it, I think, because they felt they were getting enormous pressure from their employees. You had the huge controversy at Disney, where Disney announced it was not taking a position on a particular law than it was. The CEO ultimately left. And this really started a debate in this country as to whether or not CEOs should really be that involved in the political process. They always kind of were, because companies did, through PACs and whatnot, make contributions, through their PACs, I should say, to candidates. And there were CEOs who personally contributed on both sides of the aisle to candidates. Companies were always accused traditionally of being very pro-Republican. And a case that came out of the Supreme Court that basically allowed corporations to make effectively make political contributions, not to campaigns, but to make their views known on political issues. Citizens United, if you'd recall, it came out during the Obama administration. And people on the left, at least, decried it, saying this is going to increase corporate influence over the elections. Problem is, it didn't work out that way. It turns out that most of the large corporations ended up supporting Democratic causes as opposed to Republican causes. And it was the other party who got upset about the ruling. So that's kind of where we were until now. That sets up for now.
It's very interesting you say that. There's obviously been big money flowing into politics on both sides, thanks to Citizens United, that decision, I guess that was in 2010. But that judgment put a lot of money on both sides of the political argument in the US in a way that certainly in the UK and in Europe we would find is against our sort of culture of political contributions. But the thing that's striking this time, I would have thought, was that even stating that you're in favor of free and fair elections has become something that chief executives are nervous of doing. And that seems like that takes things to a whole different level.
Oh, I think it does, because what happened was, after the significant corporate involvement, it created a blowback. It was felt that a number of companies in the stands they were taking were very, I guess, sort of left of center as opposed to right of center. And particularly following the abortion ruling of Roe v. Wade. And a lot of folks on the right of the divide felt that corporations had become captive to the left of the divide. So they threatened boycotts, attacked the CEOs for speaking out. Employees got angry, and you created a mess. And the mess, frankly, could have been avoided had the CEOs not jumped into this thing to begin with, which happened, as I said, during the Trump era and after the 2000 election. That's what really blew it up. And a lot of people, including me, said, look, you need to stay out of this completely because it divides people. And companies only work if there's unanimity within the company on corporate purpose, despite your politics. Now, that being said, the democracy point, I think you make a good one, is why is it so terrible to support democracy? Because it became a politicized term. Trump was viewed as anti-democratic or complaining about the results of the election. He was a threat to democracy. So that term became, rather than we all are supported democracy, the term became loaded in that it was, well, supporting, quote, democracy means opposing Trump, supporting, Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. That's the issue now.
So, Charles, can we just be clear? Do you think what we're seeing right now, which is essentially, it looks like the sort of hedging by CEOs, sitting on the fence, whatever you want to call it, do you think that that is because of the very real possibility of retribution by a second President Trump? Or do you think that this is a backlash or, a swing back to the norm?
Oh, I think it's a return to the tradition. I don't think it's based on, fear of retribution. It's fear of retribution from your customers. That's the problem. And that's really what happened. I think they learned the lesson that, look, by taking a stance, half the country will love you, the other half will hate you. And that's a terrible way to run a business.
People would be surprised to hear you say it's sort of back to the previous status quo, because obviously in the old days, there wasn't a sort of majority of American voters expecting potentially violence on either side of Election Day. And we hadn't had a presidential candidate refuse to concede an election result. So it does feel like the stakes are quite high.
I think the danger when you jump into this, whether you're pro or anti-Trump or pro or anti-Harris, it's that because we're so divided as a country, that no matter what you do in a political stance, you're going to offend half your audience, half your employees.
But if it shouldn't be political, though, right? I guess that's the issue. I think that's what concerns people is, and you pointed it out yourself, that what has become political is actually supporting the Constitution.
Right. I don't think the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, frankly, at their core, support violence. I don't believe that. And I think that in the end, if something does come up, I would be shocked if either party condoned it either way. I just don't think that's part of this. There's a lot of heated rhetoric, but I think when push comes to shove, ultimately the rhetoric disappears and you come together as a country. But I just don't see that happening.
Clearly, January the 6th slightly complicates that assertion. I think we'd all like to agree that you're right, but I mean, it was an uprising, and it was an uprising that did have some support from the then booted out president.
Well, he made a terrible mistake, and I think that frankly, his rhetoric was improper. I agree, and that's the problem with heated rhetoric on either side. His rhetoric or the rhetoric of using fascists, this, that, and the other. It's really a bad thing to do. It incites violence on both sides. Trump, he's a strange figure. He's a populist, and populists. Listen, Andrew Jackson was a populist. I mean, I can go back in history. I mean, I can think of, way back. La Follette was a populist. I mean, they all use that kind of rhetoric.
It's a much longer tradition in the US than it is in other places, and you certainly have populists on both sides going back into the 19th century. And we've had in the 90s and 2000s sort of precursors, Patrick Buchanan, all those people. I think you're describing when you talk about the boardroom.
Yeah.
You describe what many chief executives certainly the approach they would like to take if they feel. If they're able to, if the situation doesn't become so polarized that they're really forced to sort of stand up for something. I guess many people would say the action is elsewhere, actually, in the billionaire donors with very kind of personal support for candidates. And, in the case of Elon Musk, for example, we talk elsewhere in the program about the very public role he's taking. I just wonder whether you think that changes. Does that change the conversation?
Mr. Musk and I have had our disagreements on his pay issues. Look, I think a normal CEO, and a normal board would never have been allowed to do what Mr. Musk has done in this situation. I think that what he's done is expressed as dramatic support for one candidate, and it's polarizing. I'm sure the people who work for him probably are just as divided as the rest of the country. And taking a position like that is a real problem in your organization. And I think that gets to the heart of the issues with Tesla and the board. This was the criticism that the judge had, that the board was not independent, she found, of Mr. Musk. And I think that what's happened today kind of demonstrates that, because any normal board would say, stay out of this. This is not your area.
You say normal board, but we're talking about Elon Musk and we're talking about Tesla and we're talking about SpaceX. I mean, this is a company that reverse parked a rocket, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. It's not a normal company. Where does this end with this, as you say, this very abnormal relationship between a billionaire, an entrepreneur that's being offered a job in government, right? We know if Trump wins, he's going into government. Where does this end?
Well, I think the question is, does he actually end up with a job? And A, does Trump win? B, does he actually end up with a job in government? And C, what does that do to the rest of his companies? You got to remember, too, he's got a lot of stock in Tesla, and he leaves Tesla, as he threatened to do. The stock in Tesla falls and his worth falls. That's the crux of this whole compensation dispute, which has to do with giving him an extra 20% of the company, which you remember, or 15%, which if you remember to begin with, that he had a lot of 20 some odd percent. He sold some of it to buy X now. And so his ownership position came down. He wants this compensation to bring his position up. But if he leaves Tesla, theoretically, so it's argued, the value collapses. That's the hell of the whole thing. It's a strange situation. But the question is, why in the world would a board let someone put themselves in this particular situation? Remember,
but they
this,
did,
the
Charles.
stockholders of Tesla, they did. And that suggests to me, or at least it backs up the judge's view, that they weren't independent of him. That's all. She said in the opinion, they weren't. They were paid so much money that to be on that board, that they were not going to be independent.
Do you think there's any downside for company executives or for companies to have sat this one out to the extent that they've managed to do that? I'm just wondering, when things like in the sort of the heat of Black Lives Matter, I think there were a lot of companies that just felt, due to the nature of their customer base, they couldn't afford to stay out of it. They had to have a carefully modulated but a sort of sympathetic statement. And obviously the statement Black Lives Matter should not be controversial, even though it came to signify many things. But both in terms of their relationship with their employees and particularly certain generations, younger generations, but in the sort of broader customer base. I just wonder whether you think there's any companies that at least are a little bit nervous about the flip side. They may be worried now about retribution by future President Trump, but what about 5 or 10 years' time if they've not been vocal at key moments?
I just think you make a mistake. When you mix politics and business, politics and economics, I think you make a mistake, because an economic venture is, oddly enough, one of the few places still around where everyone can agree, and that we all want to produce a good product at a fair price and make a profit and get paid well. Everyone can agree to that. That's universal. And that's what's so nice about a business, that you check your politics at the door, you check your clients at the door. In the end, you need to separate the two. And, that's why you never talk about politics at Thanksgiving, which is coming up here in a couple of weeks, because it always ends up in a terrible argument. And it's sort of pointless. Just think of it this way. If the only people saying crazy things are the politicians, then the rest of the world stays sane. Everyone else.
If it's true that Jeff Bezos prevented the Washington Post from declaring a choice in the presidential election, as they always have in an editorial, do you think that was a good judgment by Jeff Bezos about the rest of his company?
I think it was a very bold decision on William Lewis's part. He and I are old friends, and I'm curious as to whether it came from Bezos or it came from William. But it was an interesting stance. In a way, it was smart, I think, in suggesting in this partisan year, we are going to report and let you decide. We're not going to try to influence you one way or the other. Because once you start to take a position, it affects the way you present the facts. And I think that's the argument here. Again, I don't know what the reasoning was or not, but at least when I saw it, I took it that way.
And it's complicated by the fact that 3 of the editorial board have resigned over it. I think that there's some suggestion that they had written an editorial for Kamala Harris, one. And I think the other complicating fact has to, I think we have to agree that Bezos having such financial interest, both in his Blue Origin company, but also in AWS, in federal government contracts, does make it a complex picture. I had a lot of sympathy reading his quote saying, listen, actually newspaper endorsements don't really matter anymore. I think we can all agree that there's some evidence of that, one. And also, two, your point just then is powerful, which is it just creates a sense of bias that irritates 50% of our readership. That's one hand. But on the other hand, his companies make a lot from the federal government.
That's a fair point. Again, I don't know where that came into his thinking or not. I mean,
he insists not.
It is fascinating that this is the first time I can remember where a paper actually said, there are 2 papers that are saying they're not going to endorse anyone.
That was quite clear as well. The publishers prevented, in LA Times, they've prevented it.
LA Times, yeah, which I thought was really interesting. But they have an interesting point. But do people really support the endorsements anyway? And when you endorse?
But why have they not had this point before? I guess that's what we're going back to the uniqueness of Donald Trump, aren't we? Because why is it that businesses felt more nervous about this than in the past?
And I think to just back up your point, Steph, Charles, earlier you were saying this is a healthy corrective to the kind of overindulgence of CEOs thinking people cared about their opinion, ESG and all of that. But I suppose my kind of head scratch on this is why is it at 1 minute to midnight? Why is it with sort of 10 days to go? Why did we not see this repositioning earlier in the year when they say, look, okay, we're approaching this election year and we're going to have a different approach. We're not going to be endorsing and we're going to sit back and watch.
I think the rhetoric got too hot. I think the assassination attempt, the 2 attempts on Trump, I think that the language that you began to see, the last couple of weeks, particularly the use of the term Nazi fascist, really turned up the heat so significantly that people became frightened. There's nothing more divisive than this. Listen, within families, that happens. I would constantly get into a debate with my dad at Thanksgiving, and finally I realized he's not going to change my mind, and I'm not going to change his. What's the point?
You enjoyed it. That's why.
You have raised a good point. There's many things that people are sort of bracing themselves and potentially dreading about the next few weeks. And Thanksgiving dinner with the rest of the family could well be one of them this year.
I'm going to be in England for the election, so
you come to the safe haven.
That's right.
That's fantastic, Charles Elson. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for listening to this week's Voternomics from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, with Stephanie Flanders. It was produced by Summer Sadi, production support from Isabella Ward, sound design by Moses Andam, and special thanks to Max Shafkin and Charles Elson. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.